The Vietnam War was one of the most complex and controversial conflicts in modern history, a struggle that lasted for decades and left deep scars on both the United States and Vietnam. It began not with open combat, but with political tension and ideological conflict in the aftermath of World War II. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Vietnam, then under French colonial rule, saw its chance for independence. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, declared the creation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, but France sought to reclaim control. What followed was the First Indochina War between French colonial forces and the Viet Minh, lasting until 1954. The French defeat at Dien Bien Phu was a turning point. The Geneva Accords that followed divided Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel, creating North Vietnam under communist leadership and South Vietnam under a Western-backed government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. This division, intended to be temporary until elections could reunify the country, became permanent when the elections never took place. The Cold War had already divided the world into two ideological camps, and Vietnam became a frontline of that global rivalry. The United States, determined to contain communism under the domino theory, supported South Vietnam economically and militarily, fearing that if Vietnam fell, other nations in Asia would follow. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the U.S. began sending military advisors and aid to help the South Vietnamese government fight the communist insurgency known as the Viet Cong. These guerrilla fighters, supported by North Vietnam, launched attacks throughout the countryside, aiming to overthrow the Diem regime. American involvement deepened as political instability grew in Saigon. President John F. Kennedy, who took office in 1961, increased the number of U.S. military advisors from a few hundred to over 16,000 by 1963. However, Diem's oppressive policies, particularly against Buddhist monks, led to internal. When Richard Nixon took office in January 1969, he inherited a divided nation and a costly war that seemed to have no end. More than 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam, casualties were mounting, and protests were spreading across America. Nixon's strategy was to reduce U.S. involvement while shifting more responsibility to South Vietnam, a policy he called Vietnamization. The idea was to train and equip South Vietnamese forces to take over combat operations while gradually withdrawing American troops. On paper, it seemed like a path to peace, but in reality, it was a slow and painful transition. At the same time, Nixon expanded the air war dramatically. He authorized secret bombing campaigns in neighboring Cambodia and Laos, aiming to destroy North Vietnamese sanctuaries and supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These operations, known as menu bombings, were not disclosed to the American public or Congress and later became one of the most controversial aspects of the war. The destruction caused widespread civilian casualties and political instability in Cambodia, setting the stage for future conflict there. Nixon also pursued diplomacy. In 1969, he began peace talks in Paris with representatives from North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. But the negotiations were slow and filled with distrust. Both sides accused the other of prolonging the war for political gain. Meanwhile, U.S. troop withdrawals began, but fighting on the ground intensified. South Vietnamese forces struggled to maintain control without heavy American support, while the North continued to receive aid from the Soviet Union and China. The domestic situation in the United States grew even more volatile. The anti-war movement reached new levels of intensity. Massive protests filled the streets of Washington, D.C., and other major cities. In May 1970, the U.S. invasion of Cambodia reignited national outrage. At Kent State University, National Guard troops opened fire. When Richard Nixon took office in January 1969, the United States was weary, divided, and uncertain. The war in Vietnam had dragged on for years with no clear path to victory, and domestic unrest had reached a fever pitch. Nixon, who had built his campaign on restoring law and order and achieving peace with honor, faced a nearly impossible task. He and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, sought a way to withdraw U.S. forces without appearing to abandon South Vietnam to the Communists. The new strategy was called Vietnamization. It aimed to gradually shift the burden of combat onto the South Vietnamese army while reducing American troop levels. U.S. forces would train, equip, and support the South Vietnamese military, giving them modern weapons and air power, while American soldiers would slowly come home. At first, the plan seemed to offer hope. Nixon announced troop withdrawals, which were greeted with relief at home. However, while the number of American boots on the ground decreased, the war itself intensified. To pressure North Vietnam into negotiations, Nixon expanded the bombing campaign, targeting supply routes and bases in neighboring Cambodia and Laos. These operations were kept secret from the public and even from Congress. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of jungle paths used to transport troops and supplies from north to south, ran through these neighboring countries, and Nixon believed that striking there would cripple the enemy's ability to fight. Instead, it widened the conflict and fueled more outrage. In April 1970, when Nixon finally announced the invasion of Cambodia, the reaction in the United States was explosive. Across the country, campuses erupted in protest. At Kent State University in Ohio, the National Guard opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9. The tragedy shocked the nation and symbolized the deep divide between the government and its citizens. A few days later, police killed 2 students. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, the war's physical battles had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. For the Vietnamese, reunification under the communist government in Hanoi marked both liberation and hardship. The new leaders, who had fought for decades to free their country from colonialism and foreign domination, now faced the monumental challenge of governing a nation in ruins. Cities lay in rubble, farmland was devastated, and millions of people were displaced. Nearly every family had lost loved ones. The economy was shattered, and the infrastructure that once supported daily life, roads, schools, hospitals, was destroyed or barely functioning. The North and South, long divided not just by politics but by culture, ideology, and class, had to be merged into a single society. The government under the Communist Party of Vietnam sought to build a socialist state. In the early years, they launched sweeping reforms, collectivizing agriculture, nationalizing industries, and redistributing land. But these policies met resistance, especially in the South, where many people had lived under capitalism and were suspicious of the new order. Hundreds of thousands of former soldiers, officials, and intellectuals from the old South Vietnamese regime were sent to re-education camps, where they endured years of forced labor and indoctrination. Others fled, beginning one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. Over the next decade, more than 1 million Vietnamese, known as the boat people, escaped the country on small, overcrowded vessels, facing storms, pirates, and starvation in search of safety. Many perished at sea, but others found new homes in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Europe, bringing with them stories of loss and survival. The war's end also transformed Southeast Asia. Neighboring Cambodia and Laos had been drawn into the conflict through years of U.S. bombing and communist insurgencies. In Cambodia, the chaos created by